The Nikon Z 24-120mm recently became my new go-to lens for everyday shooting and travel photography. I was able to bundle this lens with my Z8 in order to replace my 24-70mm that I've shot with for the last 5 years. I recently took trips to Washington, D.C. and Croatia where I was able to put the 24-120mm to the test to provide you a detailed review of the lens. Taking a look at the specs, the 24-120 is a full-frame lens that has a maximum aperture of f4 and a minimum aperture of f22. The price on this lens is $1,099, but I will note that there's been a lot of sales going on recently with Nikon, so there's always the chance you could get it at a lower price. As for the dimensions on this lens, it's 3.4 inches in diameter and 4.7 inches long, and it weighs 630 grams or about 1.38 pounds. Taking a look at what's on the lens, you get over here, you have your autofocus and your manual focus switch. You also have 3 rings that can be controlled here with your hands. This one comes set up as your aperture. This one is set up as your focus, and this one controls your focus length, and you can see there where the lens extends. And finally, you'll notice that there's also a programmable function button over here on the side. So you'll also notice here, if you take off the lens cap, you've got the threads here for a 77mm filter thread. That'll allow you to put on a circular polarizer, or in my case, I like to use a 10-stop filter with this one. This is actually one that I bought from Breakthrough Filters. I highly recommend the filters that they make. This particular one is a 10-stop ND filter that I used for my shots in Washington, D.C. and Croatia. And I'll leave an Amazon link down below where you can purchase this. Moving on, you also get a flare hood for the lens, and you also get the standard lens bag that comes with the lens. And the last thing that I'll note is that the minimum focus distance on this lens is 1.15 feet, or about 0.35 meters. And that focus distance holds true at any focal length. Moving on from the specs, let's go through what I liked about this lens. The first thing was the price. I think it's pretty well comparable to the 24-70mm. However, at just a little bit higher of a price, you do get that extension out to 120mm. And speaking of that, that was the other thing that I liked about this lens. Whenever I was shooting in Croatia, there were several times where I wanted to get just a little bit more reach on shots, and I was able to capture images that I wouldn't have been able to capture if I was using my normal 24-70mm lens. And the nice thing is you're not losing any of your aperture as compared to that 24-70mm lens. You've got the same maximum aperture. I also like how short the near focus distance is for this lens. It is nice to know that if I want to get in close on a foreground, I have the ability to with this lens. Next up, the size was awesome as well. It's really not that much bigger than the 24-70mm lens, and I'll get into that size a little bit later when we look at some other comparable lenses, but overall it fit perfectly into my bag for taking this trip over to Europe recently. Along with that, all of the images that I've captured so far are really sharp. I'm happy with the lens from that aspect. The pictures, the videos all look great, and I'm really happy that I decided to upgrade to this lens when I purchased my Nikon Z8. And then finally, I like that it goes as wide as 24mm. You know, I would love to go even wider than that, but for those types of shots, I just switch over to my 14-24mm f2.8. So if you like this video, first off, I'd really appreciate it if you'd stick around till the end. Hopefully you get a lot of information out of this, and maybe it helps you with a purchasing decision that you're trying to make. Additionally, please be sure to hit the like button down below, and if you want to see more content like this in the future, please be sure to hit the subscribe button. Moving on to what I dislike about this lens, it does have a little bit of vignetting issues out in the corners. That's really hard to get away from in any lens, but there's definitely some photos that I took where it was noticeable, and I do think that it could perform better in that area. The next dislike on this lens, it's personally not a big issue for me, but if you're planning on using it for videography, you'll want to be aware that it does perform poorly when it comes to focus breathing. On top of that, for my particular use case, I'm using this a lot on travel where I don't want to take a telephoto lens. So getting longer than 120mm for me would be nice. However, one trick that I came up with on this trip to Croatia is taking an image at 120mm when the scene is still and using the pixel shift mapping capability that the Z8 now has, and then I can still crop into the image that I want, and I've got plenty of pixels there to be able to do that. And also, once we get into the alternative lenses, you'll see that Nikon also has a 28 to 400 millimeter lens. And then finally, for the dislikes, one thing that I didn't like about it was that I had to change my filter sizes. I was coming from the 24 to 70 millimeter, but it uses a 72 millimeter filter thread as to where this one uses a 77 millimeter filter thread. So I had to go purchase another set of filters. But that, as you probably know, is always going to be an issue. It was just something that was frustrating that they were so close in size but weren't the same. So the last thing that I want to discuss is some of the alternatives to this lens. The first one, like I said, I had the 24 to 70 millimeter in the past. It's actually what I'm using to shoot this video on. So looking at the differences on this one, the 24 to 70 millimeter comes in at a price tag of $999.95. It's a size of a 3.1 inch diameter, and it's 3.5 inches long. And it has a weight of about 1.1 pounds or 500 grams. Additionally, it has a constant f4 max aperture, just like the 24 to 120 millimeter does, but it does have a slightly shorter minimum focus distance at 0.99 feet at all zoom positions. And really, because of these little differences in the lens, that's why I would say go with the 24 to 120 versus the 24 to 70 millimeter, even though the cost is just slightly higher. The next lens to talk about is the 24 to 200 millimeter lens. You'll want to note that this is a max aperture that ranges from f4 to f6.3 as you extend your zoom. This lens comes in at a price of $799.95, so it's slightly cheaper than the 24 to 70 and the 24 to 120. And is not one of the S-line lenses. This lens has a diameter of 3.1 inches by 4.5 inches and a weight of 570 grams or 1.26 pounds. You'll also want to note that the minimum focus distance varies as the lens is extended. So you'll notice that when you start down at a 24 millimeter zoom position, you get a minimum focus distance of 1.64 feet. But as you get to the 200 millimeter zoom position, you get limited to 2.3 feet. And you'll also note that it has no autofocus or manual focus switch. But if I were comparing this to the 24 to 70 and the 24 to 120, I would definitely still pick one of the other two lenses over this one if you're strictly trying to do photography. And the final lens that I want to discuss is the new, at this point, this is May of 2024, talking about the 28 to 400 millimeter f4 to f8 lens. So this lens comes with a price tag of $1,299.95. So slightly more expensive than the other lenses that we've already discussed. But you will note that the aperture has a separate set of ranges on it. So when you're at 28 millimeters, you'll have a max aperture of 4 to f22. And when you're at 400 millimeters, your aperture range will go from f8 to f45. As for the size, this lens is a 3.5 inch diameter, and it's 5.6 inches long when using it at 28 millimeters. However, once you extend it all the way out to 400 millimeters, it's just shy of 10 inches long. And then for weight, it's 725 grams or 1.6 pounds. The next thing that you'll want to note, again, like the 24 to 200 millimeter lens, your minimum focus distance is going to vary as you increase your zoom. So at the 28 millimeter zoom position, you're going to get a 0.66 feet or 0.2 meter minimum focal distance. And once you get out to the 400 millimeter zoom position, you're going to extend that out to 3.94 feet or 1.2 meters from the focal plane. So I would definitely say Nikon is marketing this as probably the ultimate travel lens. I have to admit, had I known about this lens and it had been on the market back in November of 2023, I probably would have waited for this lens to come out before purchasing another lens. And I can back up that claim about the travel because Nikon's CEO in the press release when this lens came out was quoted as saying, "Wherever your travel leads, this is definitely a lens to consider packing." So I think it gives you the ultimate reach. Like I said, I would probably pick it at this point, or at least consider picking it at this point over the 24 to 120 millimeter. However, I can't go back and change that. But just be aware of that if you're looking for a travel lens and something that gives you a large range of flexibility. And hopefully in the near future, I'll get a chance to actually test out the 28 to 400. Wrapping this video up, I can't express how much I really do love the 24 to 120 millimeter. Coming from the 24 to 70, it was amazing to get the little bit of extra reach on the last two trips that I took. So I definitely think there's a usefulness there to it. And it being only $100 more than the 24-70, I think it's worth that extra spin just to have a little bit more flexibility and versatility in the shooting that you do. So at this point, I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. If you have any questions, please be sure to leave them down in the comments below. Make sure to hit the like button if you enjoyed the video, and as always, please subscribe if you want to see more content like this in the future. I appreciate your time, and I'll see you in the next video.